If you want me to stop talking about racism so you can keep doing it comfortably without pause, no, because that pause you feel is not division. That pause is accountability entering the room and clearing its throat. It's 2026. If racism were only a few bad apples and a few outdated ideas, it would have burned out by now. But it hasn't. The harm still lands on the same bodies with the same consistency. In housing, in schools, in healthcare, in policing, in hiring, and who gets believed, who gets presumed as dangerous, and who gets told to get over it. That kind of predictability isn't random, it's design. People love the version of racism that lives in a single person's mouth. A slur, a tantrum, a villain you can point at and say, "That's not me." But racism in America has always been bigger than manners. It is policy, it is enforcement, it is narrative, it is an incentive, it's an operating system. And yes, we can say this with precision and fairness at the same time. Not every white person thinks the same way. Not every white person uses the slur, votes the same, or supports the same policies. But every black person lives inside the consequences of the system. There is no opt-out button for being black. There is no safe mode where you stop being targeted by the patterns. So when someone tries to end the conversation with "not all white people," I'll agree with the literal sentence, and then I'll say the part that actually matters. Racism doesn't require all. It requires enough, and it requires silence. Because silence functions like consent when harm is public. Not because silence and hatred are the same emotion. Because silence and hatred can produce the same outcome. The aggressor learns, "I'm safe here." The target learns, "I'm alone here." The room learns, "This is normal." That's how racism becomes self-sustaining. It doesn't only live in hearts, it lives in crowds, in institutions, in what gets challenged and what gets tolerated. So who is this directed at? Black people, broadly, consistently, historically, and right now. And who keeps it going across centuries? Not a cartoon villain twirling a mustache, a coalition. White supremacy survives through people who actively push it, institutions that profit from it, and a much larger circle who won't challenge it when it appears. That larger circle is what makes the system durable. Not because they're all personally hateful, but because they keep the environment hospitable for hate to operate. And you can see the symbols when the mask slips on January 6th. A gallows with a noose was displayed outside the United States Capitol. That noose wasn't abstract. It wasn't just politics. It was intimidation with historical memory. If you want to understand systemic racism, don't start with feelings. Start with levers. It lives in housing and zoning rules, lending and appraisal systems, school funding structures and district lines, hiring networks and promotion pipelines, policing patterns, prosecution and sentencing, healthcare access, environmental burdens, voting rules, and media ecosystems that train the public to associate blackness with criminality and whiteness with innocence. The old version was blunt. Slavery, black codes, Jim Crow, lynching, and explicit exclusion. The modern version often wears neutral language. It becomes litigation-proof. It becomes local control and law and order, neighborhood character, merit and personal responsibility, and just following policy. But here's the honest test. If a policy predictably harms the same group, and that harm is repeated, defended and ignored even when the outcomes are obvious, intent becomes harder and harder to deny. At some point, and that's just how it works, becomes a confession. Now let's go deeper, because the question people dodge is the one that matters most. Why is there such fear of black equality? Because equality threatens three things at once: wealth, power, and status. First, wealth. America's wealth story is not clean. A nation built on stolen labor and stolen opportunity can't cling to merit too tightly, without the floorboards creaking. Real equality doesn't just hand out seats at a table. It calls the table into question. It asks who built it, who was locked out of it, and who has been eating for generations while others were told to be grateful for crumbs. Second, power. Real equality reshapes who governs and what gets funded. It changes policing. It changes schools. It changes zoning. It changes labor. It changes the distribution of safety and opportunity. So backlash isn't confusion, it's defense. Third, status. This is the part people try to pretend is impolite to say, but reality has never been polite. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about the public and psychological wage of whiteness, the way status and deference were used as a kind of compensation, even when poor whites were being economically exploited. That concept matters because it explains something that confuses people. Why some folks will fight to preserve racial hierarchy, even when hierarchy doesn't improve their material lives, because it improves their rank. It gives them someone to stand over, someone to blame, someone to feel superior to. Equality threatens that rank. And for those invested in status, a threatened rank can feel like an emergency. So when someone says, white men are tired of racism and we're not taking it anymore, listen carefully. Often what they mean is not, we're tired of racism. They mean, we're tired of being asked to pause. We're tired of being challenged. We're tired of having our comfort interrupted. That's not exhaustion with racism. That's exhaustion with accountability. This is one of the signature moves of racism in 2026, making the conversation the crime. You name harm, and they call the naming racism. You mention slavery's afterlives, and they say, get over it. You raise reparations, and they say, stop living in the past. You point to the wealth gap, and they insist the real problem is you bringing it up. They want racism to end, but they don't want racism to end. They want the discussion to end. Because if you stop speaking, they get to keep living without interruption inside the fantasy that nothing is happening. Toni Morrison put it like this: the very serious function of racism is distraction. Distraction from what? From repair, from power, from accountability, from policy, from the fact that the system keeps reproducing unequal outcomes and then blames black people for surviving them. And here's the part that the not all conversation rarely includes, but fairness demands it. A lot of people don't use slurs. A lot of people want to think of themselves as decent, but when a black person gets hit with the N-word, hard R in a public space, and nobody steps in, what is that? That's not neutrality. That's a community decision. That's the crowd granting permission. And this is why the bystander issue is not a side topic. It is central. Because systemic racism needs two things to survive: active pushers and passive allowers. The passive allowers are the shield. Martin Luther King Jr. warned about this in his critique of the white moderate, the person more devoted to order than justice. It wasn't a complaint about feelings. It was a diagnosis of mechanics. The system depends on people who disapprove privately but refuse to intervene publicly. And I understand why they don't intervene. Let's not pretend it's mysterious. People fear conflict. They fear social punishment. They fear being ostracized in their own group. They fear becoming the target. They fear losing belonging, losing reputation, losing convenience. I get it. But if you claim you want racism to end, you do not get to treat your fear of awkwardness as more important than someone else's humanity. You don't get to outsource all the risk to black people and then call yourself an ally because you would never say that. In a system like this, the baseline cannot be, I don't say the slur. The baseline has to become, I interrupt the slur, I interrupt the lie, I interrupt the policy excuse. This is what I mean when I say the change has to start from the inside. Black people can explain racism perfectly for another 500 years, and it still won't matter if the people who benefit refuse to police their own spaces. In too many rooms, black voices aren't heard as legitimate authority. They are heard as noise, as complaint, as threat, as making everything about race. But in-group voices get heard. In-group disapproval carries weight. In-group consequences change behavior. So if you're white and you truly want this to end, the most important work you can do is not perform support when black people are present. It's enforcing norms when they aren't. That's the inside job. That means checking your friends, checking your family, checking your group chats, checking the jokes, checking the "I'm just saying," checking the people who can't hear black people, but can hear each other perfectly fine. You have to be willing to risk something, not your life, not some grand heroic fantasy, but the real currency of everyday complicity, comfort, belonging, social ease. People sometimes describe this as needing more folks like John Brown. I'm not talking about copying a historical moment literally. I'm talking about the principle, a willingness to pay a social price so black people stop paying the entire price. And if you think silence protects you, it doesn't. Audre Lorde said, "Your silence will not protect you." So here's what change looks like in the real world in 2026, in plain language. In the moment, it looks like a short, direct interruption. No, don't use that word. That's racist. Stop. We're not doing that here. If you keep going, I'm leaving and I'm reporting it. No debate, no long lecture, a boundary, an interruption, a consequence. After the moment, it looks like public support for the person targeted. I saw that. That was wrong. You're not alone. That doesn't represent all of us, and it's not welcome here. And it looks like enforcing consequences in whatever community you're in. Removing people, reporting accounts, escalating in workplaces and schools, refusing to normalize it as just politics. Because racism is bold when it is rewarded with attention, laughter, and silence. It shrinks when it is met with social cost. Now, zoom out to policy, because culture and policy feed each other. If policy created the wealth gap and opportunity gap, policy must help close them. Otherwise, progress is just branding. If you want real equality, you have to touch the pipelines that produce inequality. Housing access, fair lending, school funding, healthcare access, environmental burdens, criminal legal reform, voting access, labor protections, and wealth-building pathways that don't depend on inherited advantage. If someone says, "Get over it," what they're really saying is, accept the outcome. But the outcome is still here. The gap is still here. The targeting is still here. The erasure is still here. The slurs are still here. The silence is still here. So no, I won't stop talking about it. Because quiet has never been the cure. Quiet has been the cover. And if you're listening and you truly want it to end, understand this. You don't end a system like this with vibes. You end it by disrupting the places it's taught, the places it's enforced, and the places it's defended. Frederick Douglass said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." So here is the demand. If your comfort requires my silence, the answer is no. If your peace depends on my erasure, the answer is no. If your idea of moving on means black people carry the memory, the cost, and the consequence alone, the answer is no. And to the people who claim they don't believe in racism but never speak when it appears, if you want it to end, you don't get to be silent. Silence is a vote for the status quo. Be the interruption. Be the consequence. Be the person who changes what's normal in the room. Because nothing changes until the people who can stop it where it's taught decide they love justice more than they love belonging. Truth paste.